few months ago, we told you about a homelessness bill of rights that was being pursued by State Representative Mia Gregerson, the Democrat from SeaTac. And at the time that we exclusively reported on one of the draft bills that she was working on, or her office was working on, she had put out a statement saying, whoa, this is just a document of some sort, and we don't know what we're going to do. It's not what Jason Rantz says. And then she backtracked a little bit, only to then stealthily add a new piece of legislation that is just as bad, if not worse, than what she first proposed. This bill would prevent a city or a town from limiting or banning homeless encampments, which effectively legalize them on public property all across the state of Washington. And even worse, it gives special legal advantages to people who are homeless so that when they sue over an ordinance, it is a virtual guarantee that they win. It's House Bill 1380. For all my fellow nerds out there who write this stuff down, I do as well. 1380. It says a city or town can only regulate a homeless encampment on public spaces in a way that a judge would deem to be, quote, objectively reasonable as to time, place, and manner. Now, that sounds kind of vague. Objectively reasonable? This is subjective. By definition, it's subjective. How can it be objective? You know how I know by definition it's subjective? Because Mia Gregerson is someone who doesn't think it's ever appropriate to ban homeless encampments, and I think it's always appropriate. So how can we say it's objectively appropriate?
Just meet in the middle, you know.
It's not a reasonable position for them to pretend is the reality. And it would apply retroactively, meaning our friends in the city of Burien, for example, and they're not the only ones. Lots of cities have these around the Puget Sound. Their homeless encampment ban would be subject to the new reasonable test that a judge would see if one of these ordinances or laws gets challenged in court. Oof. Now, under this bill, a homeless person has the right to sue a city or a town over one of these restrictions. Allows them to seek injunctive or declaratory relief. But they're granted as an affirmative defense that the restriction itself is not reasonable. If a city or a town loses the case, you and I, the taxpayers of that individual city or town, would have to pay the attorney's fees for the plaintiff, in this case, the homeless person, who would be undoubtedly working with groups like the ACLU to sue for every single encampment ordinance. Now, because Democrats love to gaslight and just flat out lie, they just argue disingenuously. They do it in bad faith. Let's listen to Mia Gregerson argue for her bill and how this is actually a benefit for cities and towns.
Wasting precious tax dollars to defend lawsuits is definitely not the answer. And I believe we all want what our local governments want, that all of our people from all backgrounds and all incomes have a place that they can sleep and store their belongings safely at night. Because without that, it's hard for any community to feel safe. I fully believe that the intentions between us are almost aligned.
They're not almost aligned. They're not. You can talk like this in this just very intentional, low-key, heartfelt tone. You can talk like this all you want, but that doesn't change the reality that you're trying to pursue legislation that would legalize homeless encampments, which would keep people outside, whereas the rest of us want to bring them inside so they don't die.
I hate that. People don't patronize me with the soft-sounding voice.
It is, and maybe this is just her natural voice. I haven't heard her speak all that often, but it certainly sounds like I'm putting on a little bit of a show because you and I, we're on the same page. We're separated by just small details like my willingness to allow cities to be overtaken by homeless encampments and your unwillingness to allow the homeless to take over. But I mean, that is just a small detail because truly we want the same thing in the end.
but it's just the lack of communication and language, the definitions that divide us, and they lead us to mismatched assumptions.
Ugh.
This bill is carefully crafted to preserve the ability for each jurisdiction to regulate their residents' use of public space and to decide what they think is objectionably reasonable.
No, that's not true. That is not true. What she just said there is not true. One might say it's a lie. And that one person who might say it is me. She's lying. She's lying. And it's very clear how this very vague and very poorly constructed law would discourage a city or town from coming up with any kind of homeless encampment restriction. Again, she and I obviously would disagree on what is appropriate, what is reasonable. Objectively, we are going to have two completely different viewpoints. But we're not judges, right? We wouldn't get to decide this. So let's say you institute a policy, an ordinance, you pass a law banning homeless encampments from within 500 feet of a school, which is something that the legislature is currently looking at. It's not going to go anywhere, unfortunately. But let's say that's the bill. Okay. Homeless dude over there says, the ACLU, they keep bugging me to sue. I mean, they're not going to give me even a glass of water or some soup to keep me warm, but they will represent me in court. Okay. So they go to court. The judge says, I actually think this is objectively reasonable. You found the one sane judge in all of the county. I'm upholding the ordinance. You lose. Okay. You think that that's done. Except a second homeless person ends up suing, also from the ACLU, gets a different judge, which is almost guaranteed. And that judge says, oh, isn't this your lucky day? Because I'm a crazy progressive. And I find all of these laws to be unreasonable. So, yeah, you win. Sorry, city. Take out your ordinance. It's wrong. And pay the ACLU of Washington who's representing the homeless person. That's what could happen. The same exact law could be challenged multiple times, which then becomes a nuisance for the cities and the towns. And unless you're a Seattle or maybe a Spokane, cities can't really afford this. And really, given the budgetary problems in Seattle and Spokane, neither can they. They don't want, even if they could afford it, they don't want to be sued constantly over these ordinances until essentially via the judge shopping, it gets in front of a judge who's going to invalidate it as unreasonable. But you couldn't get that impression from her comments there, right? Oh my gosh.
She sounded so nice.
Not only nice, but so reasonable. It allows you to ultimately decide as a city until someone sues and a judge decides that they're going to go with the homeless. And here's what's even worse about this bill that she so, I'm sure, unintentionally left out. Maybe she just forgot. Part of her bill gives a huge advantage to the homeless person who is suing. Okay? It instructs the court to consider the impact that the ordinance, the encampment ban or restriction would have on the homeless person as it relates to them keeping dry and warm. Okay? So the judge doesn't have to and is not told that they have to consider the impact that a law would have on a community that maybe has had a rash of homeless people causing all sorts of problems. It specifically tells them to consider the impact that it would have on the homeless when determining whether or not something is reasonable. It's almost like this is written in a way that pretty much guarantees that the homeless person is always going to win. How could the homeless person not win under that specific circumstance? Well, you're trying to keep warm and dry. It's raining outside right now, so it's not reasonable for them to ban you from camping in that tent over there because it's keeping you warm and dry. It's not reasonable. You cannot win under the way that this was written, or as she says, very thoughtfully written. I agree with that. It was thoughtfully written. It was thoughtfully written to make sure that these encampment bans never go forward. And it's why so many cities had either mayors or some representative coming up and speaking out against this bill. And there were mayors from her own district who came out and said, no, No. And I spoke to one yesterday, a mayor, and I asked, did y'all get a heads up on this? They were like, well, we did technically get a heads up, and then she immediately filed the legislation, so we didn't even have any say whatsoever, even though she represents us. But Normandy Park Mayor Eric Zimmerman, he spoke at this hearing yesterday. It was happening in the middle of our show. And he says, yeah, this doesn't do what you think it does.
House Bill 1380 will not reduce homelessness. It will worsen it by forcing cities to continue bad strategies like encampments that increase human suffering. Two recent studies the legislature needs to look at, the California statewide and the University of Chicago Meyer study, are really the best modern insights that we have into homelessness right now. And these studies show that while 36 million Americans tragically do live below the poverty line and cope with housing costs and unaffordability, only 2% of them become homeless. The difference between the...
What? But I was told that because of how expensive housing is, everyone's becoming homeless. And they never mention drugs because it's not really a reason whatsoever.
You know that mind blown emoji? That's me right now.
That, like the little brain exploding? Are you okay? I mean, you do look a little shaken to your core.
Just guts all over the place. The studio.
It's very disgusting.
Poor and housed 98% and the poor and homeless 2% tells us what our legislation needs to aim at. These studies tell us that the vast majority of the unsheltered are single men without children who've endured many years of income below the poverty line prior to losing housing. And the most frequent trigger mentioned for the loss of housing is social and not economic. In fact, more than half of the cohort in the California study didn't even mention an economic reason. But this group does have a very high prevalence of lifetime untreated addiction and mental illness, which erodes their personal social safety net. And the group has a high rate of physical and cognitive disability.
Sir, Mr. Mayor, even though I am very familiar with the study because I've written and talked about it before and you're being honest, I'm going to accuse you of lying. Because Mia Gregerson is on the side of helping the homeless by keeping them outside. This is the tyranny of the majority. This has a bunch of co-sponsors. Now, maybe because it's city mayors, not just from Gregerson's district, but all around the state who are speaking up against this, maybe it convinces some right-minded Democrats to reject this. There are a few. Mari Levitt is one of them, a Democrat who seems, at least this session, pretty darn reasonable. I don't know how many of her exist on the left, but this is a perfect example of a bill that completely reshapes our communities, and it's inspired by the radical views of Seattle, even though Mia Gregerson doesn't come from Seattle. But she takes her inspiration from it. Do you remember when we didn't clean up, we didn't sweep the encampments during COVID? Not just in Seattle, by the way, but remember what that was like? Was that great?
No.
What's trending in Seattle?
And I hit a button on accident.
You okay over there?
Yes.
Your mind is still so blown from this bill that you're accidentally pushing buttons you shouldn't. Although at least you said Seattle in that one.
Yeah, that's
and I was
true.
talking about Seattle. But the truth is, the same was the case in Puyallup, right? In Tacoma, in Spokane, in Bellingham. Remember that huge encampment in Bellingham? It's probably still there. I know they said they were going to start cleaning it up behind those apartments by the Walmart. Yeah, it's probably still there. I mean, this is outrageous. And so do you want to, I don't know, do something about this, say something? You can. I include the link to the bill. And if you go to the bill's website, there's a place where you can leave your comment, at least go on record. It will take you 3 minutes. And I'm only giving you an extra minute and a half for the spelling errors that you might have to correct. Because if you rush it, you might have some misspellings or bad grammar, a comma that's misplaced, or forgetting an apostrophe. So I'm giving you an extra minute or so. 3 minutes to say something. So go to KTTH.com or go ahead and text the keyword RANTZ, R-A-N-T-Z, to 1-800-465-8770. I'll send you a link to my blog for you to read, for you to click on that little link, and then leave some comments. Or, of course, just contact, especially if you're in a Democrat district. This is not going to get any Republican support, so I'm giving you a little bit of a pass here. But if you're in an area that has either a state rep or a senator who's a Democrat, they're the ones you need to contact. Call, email, be civil, of course. but tell them on this particular bill, it should be a huge, huge, huge no.